Everyone in the courtroom could feel it. So, what exactly was in that name that made a judge rise to her feet in front of a man she was supposed to sentence? Before we reveal that, hit the subscribe button and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And don't miss tomorrow's powerful Royal Guard story, coming right at this same time. It was just past 6 on a gray Thursday morning, and Wellington Barracks was still mostly quiet. The rain from the night before had left the air smelling of stone and damp leather, and most of the guardsmen moved with the half-silent rhythm of men trained not to make noise before breakfast. Inside the preparation room, Corporal William Hartley sat on a wooden bench, his head bowed slightly, as he polished his boots with long, methodical strokes. He was 35, built like he'd been carved out of granite, and known in the barracks by one name only: Silent Will. A Coldstream guard with 12 years of service, Will had once jumped out of aircraft over Helmond Province. He'd lost a brother in the sand there, a brother who wore pips on his shoulder and never came back. These days, Will carried that loss like he carried everything else, quietly, with precision. A knock at the door interrupted the scrape of brush against boot. "Mail," came a voice. "Special courier." Will looked up. An officer entered, holding a cream-colored envelope. It had the unmistakable air of something not meant to be opened casually. The royal cipher glinted in the corner. He handed it to Will with a faint, unreadable expression. Will wiped his hands, took the envelope, and opened it without ceremony. Inside was a formal summons. Southern Crown Court. Appearance required. Allegation of excessive force. The words didn't register at first. Then his eyes locked on the date. 3 weeks ago. The incident. St. James's Palace. A man, red in the face, gripping a woman by the wrist. The woman had looked up at Will through the barrier, her eyes silently pleading. Will had stepped forward, not shouting, not making a scene, just placing a hand on the man's arm and telling him to release her. The man had resisted. Will had used a basic wrist control hold, something drilled into him since basic training. Security arrived minutes later. The woman had mouthed, "Thank you," as she vanished into the crowd. That was supposed to be the end of it, but it wasn't. Now the man, Lucas Dre, apparently was accusing Will of assault, of abusing ceremonial authority, of acting outside his station as a guard and using force to humiliate a private citizen. There had been no warning, no internal inquiry. The palace had confirmed the court's summons, no exemptions, no military deferrals, and the kicker? He was to appear in full ceremonial uniform. That included the bearskin. Will folded the letter, stood, and placed his boots side by side beneath the bench. His face didn't change. Not a twitch of the jaw, not a blink too fast. But those nearby young guardsmen lacing up their gaiters or brushing their tunics saw the shift. "Everything all right, Corp?" one of them asked. Will gave a single nod. "Court date?" The room went still. "Over that bloke?" another whispered. "Thought that was done with." "Apparently not." He left it at that. By lunchtime, the whispers had circled through the barracks. Some called it a joke, others a disgrace. But no one asked Will again, because those who knew him understood one thing. If he wasn't talking, it meant he was ready. By sunset, his kit was already hanging, pressed and perfect, on the rail. His bearskin rested on its stand, towering and solemn in the corner like a silent judge. The guardsmen went to sleep, knowing that one of their own would be in a courtroom the next morning. Not as a witness, not in uniform for show, but on trial. And still, Will said nothing. He just polished his buttons until they caught the last sliver of the barracks light. The steps outside Southwark Crown Court glistened with early morning drizzle as photographers adjusted their lenses, murmuring among themselves. Royal guards didn't often find themselves on trial, certainly not in full ceremonial uniform. The case had stirred enough curiosity to pull a few journalists from their usual haunts, especially once word got out that the defendant had been ordered to appear in bearskin and scarlet. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. Spectators filled the benches early. Some were law students, others local press, and a few were civilians curious enough to line up before sunrise. The whisper that a guardsman had assaulted a civilian outside a palace had drawn both scorn and sympathy. Then, just past 9:15, the heavy doors opened. Corporal William Hartley stepped into the chamber. He moved the same way he did on parade, measured, deliberate, precise. His tall black bearskin added a full 18 inches to his already solid frame. His tunic was perfect. Every brass button gleamed. Every crease sat exactly where it should. His boots shone like mirrors. He carried nothing in his hands, said nothing, simply walked to the defendant's table and stood. A hush fell over the room. "Christ!" someone whispered near the gallery. "Looks like a statue." The prosecutor, Elliot Dean, leaned back in his chair with a theatrical sigh. Tall, lean, with prematurely silver hair and a barrister's smirk. Dean didn't even try to hide his disdain. "He thinks the red coat makes him untouchable," he murmured to his assistant. At the plaintiff's table sat Lucas Dray, the complainant, clean-shaven, designer-suited, and gleaming with smugness. Dray barely glanced at Will. His eyes were on the crowd. He was loving the attention. His legal team, 2 suited solicitors and a junior barrister, sat to either side, tapping their tablets and nodding along to his every word. Back near the door, a junior officer from Will's unit had shown up quietly and taken a seat. Second Lieutenant Rory Davis, not long out of Sandhurst, looked uneasy in his chair, as if unsure whether he should stand in salute or stay hidden in support. He held his cap on his knees, eyes locked on Will's unmoving figure. Court officers whispered to one another as they checked their notes. The clerk double-checked her pronunciation of Cold Stream. Then came the call, "All rise!" Everyone stood. The doors to the judge's chamber opened, and Justice Caroline Hale entered with her usual brisk, efficient pace, robes flowing, expression unreadable, until she looked up. She saw the defendant. Then her gaze flicked to the docket in her hand. She stopped walking. Her eyes returned to the man in red and black, standing still beside the defense table. She blinked once quickly, then again, slower this time. Her mouth opened slightly as if to say something, but she didn't. Not yet. The clerk began the formal announcement. Case number 4029A, Crown versus Corporal William Arthur Hartley. And that was when it happened. Justice Hale didn't sit. She stood silent, holding the docket as if frozen. She stared at the name again. Corporal William Arthur Hartley. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lowered the docket, stepped fully behind the bench, and looked at the man before her. Her voice came quieter than usual. "Be seated." The room settled, but something had changed. Her posture was different now. The usual stiffness of authority had softened, only slightly, but enough for the sharpest eyes to notice. The clerk cleared her throat, confused. "Shall we proceed, Your Honor?" Justice Hale nodded slowly, But her gaze hadn't left Will. Not once. Elliot Dean stood first, filing his papers with exaggerated care. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a case not of violence, but of vanity. A man draped in costume who used the weight of tradition as a weapon against a civilian. He turned and gestured toward Will. Dignified though he may appear, Corporal Hartley is not above the law, and ceremonial silence is not a substitute for accountability. The judge gave no reaction, but her eyes lingered, just a second too long. Something about that name had shaken her, and everyone in the courtroom could feel it. Justice Hale sat straighter than usual, but the weight in her eyes suggested something had unsettled her beneath the robe's formality. She didn't reach for her pen, didn't scribble notes. She simply stared for a long, careful moment at the man in the scarlet tunic, standing so still at the defense table. "Corporal William Arthur Hartley," she repeated under her breath, just loud enough that the clerk beside her glanced over. Will didn't move, didn't acknowledge it. His eyes were forward, shoulders level. His presence was more than posture. It was a wall. The clerk cleared her throat. "Shall we proceed, Your Honor?" Justice Hale nodded once, and finally reached for her notepad, though the motion looked almost mechanical. Elliot Dean adjusted his robes with the flair of someone used to being watched. He launched into his opening remarks, his voice crisp and rehearsed. "This is not a military court. This is a civilian trial in which a citizen, my client, was physically manhandled by a soldier outside St. James's Palace. This is not a question of terrorism, threat, or security. This is a question of excess, a question of unchecked power wielded under the shield of ceremony." He gestured to Will like an exhibit. "We see a man dressed in military regalia, carrying centuries of inherited reverence. But what does that mean when applied to a civilian altercation?" Justice Hale didn't interrupt, but she wasn't taking notes either. Her attention was not on Dean. It remained tethered, curiously, unshakably, to the still figure in red. Dean continued. "My client, Mr. Dre, was forcibly grabbed and restrained by the defendant in a public setting. There was no official arrest, no formal complaint filed by anyone except my client. Yet the guard took it upon himself to act as enforcer of both law and morality." He closed his folder with a satisfying clap. "And that, Your Honor, is where tradition becomes tyranny." There was a pause just long enough for the room to settle into that soft ambient courtroom tension where the air itself feels brittle. Then the judge spoke. Her voice was even, but something behind it had changed. "And the defense?" Will's counsel, a military-appointed solicitor named Mayor Rawlings, stood calmly. "With the court's permission," she said, "Corporal Hartley will testify directly." Justice Hale nodded again, slower than necessary. Will moved at last. He removed his bearskin hat with both hands and placed it carefully on the table before him. Then he stepped forward. The quiet scrape of his boots on the stone floor was the only sound in the room. The oath was administered. He answered each line with a level tone, and then he stood, facing the gallery, ready to speak, but the judge raised a hand. "One moment, Corporal." He froze. Justice Hale leaned forward slightly, her expression now unreadable. "Your brother? Was his name Arthur Hartley?" Will blinked just once, then nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." There it was. A single breath caught in her throat before she spoke again, softer now. "Thank you. You may proceed." The courtroom didn't stir, but the tension shifted. Not confusion, not discomfort. Something deeper. Something like recognition, wrapped in silence. Because in that room, with its stone walls and cold pews and layers of formality, a woman in robes had just remembered something the uniform didn't say. And for reasons no one yet understood, that name, Hartley, had just changed everything. Corporal William Hartley stood at the witness stand with the same deliberate calm he brought to every parade square, every state ceremony, every moment tourists tried to make him flinch. He didn't posture. He didn't clear his throat or ask for water. He just stood there, hands clasped behind his back, shoulders level, and waited. "Corporal," said his solicitor, Mayor Rawlings, "can you walk the court through what happened on the day in question?" Will nodded once. It was a Thursday, early shift. I had just rotated from main gate duty to the west entrance at St. James's. His voice was low, clear. It was raining lightly. Tourists were gathered near the fountain. I saw a woman, mid-30s, brown coat, yellow umbrella, standing near the rail. He paused, letting the image form in his head before continuing. She was visibly upset, eyes red, shoulders hunched. Beside her was a man. He was gripping her wrist tight. She said, "Please, let go." Twice. "And what did you do?" "I stepped forward," Will said simply. Identified myself, told him to release her arm. Did he comply? No. He squared his body toward me and said, "Mind your bloody business." Then he shoved me. Somewhere in the gallery, someone shifted in their seat. Will continued. "I performed a wrist control hold. It's standard. No strikes, no injury intended. I held him until palace security arrived." Rawlings nodded. "Did you, at any point, threaten him?" "No." "Raise your voice?" "No." "Say anything beyond what you just described?" Will paused. Then I told him, "Let go, or I will make you let go." And after he shoved me, I said, "You've made your choice." That was it. The courtroom was still. Even Elliot Dean was momentarily quiet, shuffling papers without purpose. Rawlings let the silence linger a moment, then said, "Do you believe your actions were justified?" Will didn't blink. "Yes." "Why?" He looked straight ahead, not at the judge, not at the barrister, but somewhere deeper. "Because the person being hurt didn't have the voice to make it stop, so I lent her mine." Rawlings stepped back. "No further questions." Dean stood. He didn't look pleased. "Corporal Hartley, let's pretend for a moment you're not dressed in centuries of ceremonial history. Let's say you're just a man on a pavement wearing jeans. Would you still have stepped in?" "Yes," Will said without hesitation. "So, you believe it's your role to intervene in civilian matters?" Will tilted his head slightly. "When someone's being hurt?" "Yes." Dean's lips curled. "So, you're judge, jury, and executioner now?" "No," Will replied evenly. "But I'm not an observer either." Dean pushed forward, voice rising. "You weren't ordered to act. You weren't authorized to detain. You weren't assigned to security. You were supposed to stand still and keep your mouth shut. Isn't that what the guard does?" Will's answer came slow and firm. "Sometimes standing still is duty, and sometimes it's cowardice." The gallery murmured. Justice Hale didn't shush them. Dean frowned. "So you're saying silence is what? A choice?" Will finally turned his head just slightly toward the barrister. His eyes were calm but steady. "I've stood silent at funerals, at palaces, in front of crowds throwing slurs. I have mastered silence. But that day," he shook his head, "silence would have been complicity. There was no applause, no gasps, just silence. The right kind. Justice Hale scribbled something in her notepad, but she didn't look down as she did it. Her eyes were still on Will, focused, intent, and in that moment the man who had been accused of using too much presence was finally being heard. There was a hush in the room after Will stepped down from the stand. The kind that feels like everyone's holding their breath, not out of fear, but from the gravity of something unspoken settling in. Just as Hale adjusted her glasses, Elliot Dean flipped through papers that no longer seemed useful. Mayor Rawlings glanced toward her client, but Will simply returned to his seat, back straight, hands resting calmly on his knees. Then, from the gallery, a quiet voice broke the silence. "Your Honor, may I say something?" Every head turned. A woman had stood in the middle row, brown coat, dark hair, a yellow umbrella folded in her hands. She looked nervous but not fragile. Justice Hale peered over her glasses. "Are you Miss Colton?" "Yes, Your Honor." "You're not on the witness list." "I wasn't asked to be," she said, "but I was there. I was the woman he helped." The judge looked to Dean, who opened his mouth only to close it again without protest. Justice Hale gave a single nod. "You may speak." Miss Colton stepped forward slowly, the weight of 100 eyes following her. When she reached the front, she stood beside the witness box without entering it. "I didn't know there'd be a trial," she said. "I didn't even know he'd gotten in trouble for what he did." She glanced at Will. "I wasn't going to come. I thought maybe it didn't matter anymore, but when I read about it in the papers and saw the pictures, they made it sound like he was the aggressor. Like he was the one who caused harm. And that's not what happened." Dean shifted uncomfortably. Miss Colton didn't flinch. "Lucas Dray is not my partner. He's someone who had been following me for weeks." I said no. I said it politely. I said it loudly. He wouldn't stop. "That day, he found me by chance, near the palace, and grabbed me when I tried to walk away." Her voice tightened slightly, but her tone remained controlled. "He was hurting me. Not badly, not bruises, but enough that I was afraid, and no one did anything. People watched. No one said a word except him." She gestured toward Will. "He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't humiliate him. He just stepped in and made it stop." She paused. "I didn't need a police report. I didn't want attention. I just wanted to feel safe. And for that 5 minutes, I did. Because of him." A hush followed her words, quiet but not empty. It was the kind of silence that wraps around a truth too clean to argue with. Elliot Dean finally rose. "Miss Colton, I must remind you, this court requires objectivity. Personal gratitude, however sincere, cannot substitute proper protocol." She turned to him without hesitation. "Then maybe protocol needs adjusting." A few murmurs rippled through the gallery. Justice Hale raised a hand, silencing the room. "Thank you, Miss Colton," she said softly. Miss Colton gave one small nod to the judge and another, slightly fuller, to Will. Then she returned to her seat without further word, her folded umbrella resting in her lap like a quiet badge of witness. And with her presence, the case had shifted. Not in drama, not in legal twist, just in weight, the kind that made truth feel heavier than accusation. Justice Hale didn't say it, but everyone in that room could sense it. The picture was now complete. Justice Hale returned from chambers precisely 33 minutes after the last word had been spoken. Everyone stood as she entered, even Lucas Dray, who had stopped fidgeting and now sat with folded hands, his eyes low. "Be seated," she said, her voice measured. The gavel was untouched beside her. She didn't need it. She glanced once at the prosecution table, then at the defense. Finally, her eyes settled on Will, who hadn't moved since sitting down. She studied him not as a judge appraising a witness, but as a woman reading a name carved into memory. "This court has reviewed the evidence and testimony provided," she began. "It is heard from the defense, the claimant, and from a previously absent but material eyewitness." She looked briefly to Miss Colton, who nodded once. "There is no CCTV footage from the incident. No prior record of misconduct on the part of Corporal Hartley. No visible injury sustained by Mr. Dray, nor a police complaint filed until after media attention presented an opportunity." Her gaze hardened slightly. "The court finds the complainant's motivations questionable at best, and the defendant's conduct, while outside strict ceremonial remit, falls firmly within the bounds of reasonable intervention." She paused. "The case is dismissed." A ripple of relief passed through the benches. Not applause, not gasps, just the slow exhale of justice being done. Even Dean begrudgingly closed his folder with a little more respect than he had opened it with. But Justice Hale wasn't finished. She leaned back in her chair, setting her glasses aside. "Before we adjourn," she said, "I'd like to speak to the court, not as a judge but as a mother." That changed the air. Everyone could feel it. 12 years ago," she said, "my son was stationed with the Royal Engineers in Helmond Province. A routine convoy ambushed on the return to Camp Bastion. His unit was pinned and several vehicles were hit. My son was in the third lorry, injured and trapped under debris." Her voice didn't waver, but her hands gripped the arms of her chair. "He survived because a paratrooper disobeyed an order and ran through enemy fire to pull him out. That soldier was Lieutenant Arthur Hartley." A quiet gasp rippled through the back row. Justice Hale looked directly at Will. "Your brother?" Will didn't nod, didn't shift, but his eyes, those quiet, steel-cold eyes, lifted and locked onto hers. "I never got to thank him," she said. "Not in person, not in letters. He died 2 days later from wounds sustained in that rescue." Her voice caught just once, then steadied. "I remembered the name. Mr. Hartley. The moment I saw you, it hit me like cold water. You walked into this courtroom bearing not just uniform and posture, but legacy. And I want you to know the name Hartley does not deserve to stand accused in my courtroom." The room was silent. Not the awkward silence of protocol, but the thick, reverent stillness of people witnessing something raw, something real. Justice Hale looked around the room, then stood without fanfare. "Case dismissed," she repeated softly. "This hearing is closed." She didn't tap the gavel. She didn't retreat in robes. She just stepped down from the bench and left the room. And still no one moved. For a few seconds it felt like the whole world had paused to breathe with them. The courtroom emptied slowly, like a tide receding, not out of chaos, but quiet awe. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Barristers packed up, their cases with more care than usual. Reporters whispered urgently into phones, but Will Hartley remained seated, still in full dress, his bearskin now resting on his lap. He hadn't spoken since the verdict. He didn't need to. He watched the oak panel doors swing open and shut, watched the plaintiff and his solicitor disappear in silence, watched Miss Colton pass by with a small nod, her yellow umbrella now unfurled against the drizzle beyond the windows. When he finally stood to leave, the hall outside was nearly empty. Marble columns stretched up into shadows, echoing the sound of his boots on stone. He had just passed through the doors when he heard it, the unmistakable rhythm of firm, deliberate footsteps behind him. He stopped. "Corporal Hartley." He turned just as Hale was approaching from the corridor, no longer in robes, her hair slightly windblown, a leather satchel slung over her shoulder like any other civil servant on her way out. But there was nothing ordinary about the look in her eyes. "Just a moment," she said, stopping a few feet from him. "Please." Will came to a respectful attention but said nothing. She took a breath. "I meant what I said in there. I never thanked your brother. I should have. I tried once, but the letter felt inadequate, and then time passed." Will finally spoke. "He never expected thanks?" She nodded slowly. "No, but sometimes we still need to give it for ourselves." She hesitated, then added, "I spent years in rooms like this, calling names, reading charges. It becomes automatic, routine. But today I heard a name and remembered what it cost." A long pause stretched between them. Then she looked him directly in the eye. "The way you stood today, in silence, in discipline, it reminded me of what dignity looks like. Not ceremony, not spectacle, just conviction." Will didn't flinch. "It's just duty, Your Honor." "No," she said. "It's honor, and those aren't always the same." She adjusted her coat, preparing to leave, but paused once more. "If the guard ever puts you on trial again," she said quietly, "call me as a witness." A faint smirk tugged at the corner of Will's mouth just for a moment. "Understood, Your Honor." She gave one final nod, then turned and walked away, the echo of her steps trailing off into the corridor's hush. Will watched her go, then turned toward the heavy courthouse doors. He didn't look vindicated. He looked unchanged. Same boots, same posture, same scarlet shoulders braced beneath centuries of tradition. He didn't walk any faster than he had when entering. He didn't look around for approval. He simply moved forward out into the London rain. Outside, traffic hummed. The city carried on. Tourists passed by without noticing the guard stepping into the drizzle, one hand adjusting the strap on his ceremonial rifle. He paused at the foot of the courthouse steps, then descended, measured, deliberate, as if still on parade. Because in a world that shifts too quickly, some men don't need applause to know they've done right. Sometimes, walking forward is the only statement they need. Would you have spoken up if you saw someone falsely accused in court? Do you think Royal Guard should be punished for stepping in during a civilian emergency? And has someone's name or legacy ever changed how you saw them, even for just a moment? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. If this story moved you, hit the like button and make sure you're subscribed. Don't forget the bell icon so you never miss our daily Royal Guard stories. Share this video with someone who thinks duty ends at the palace gates. It doesn't. Our next Royal Guard story is already on your screen. Tap to watch it now, and we'll see you tomorrow.